Hello folks, and welcome to the training video for the Future of Agriculture Curriculum for Teaching Sustainability, or FACS. And this is kind of a low-budget training film. We only have so many resources, but it should do the trick in terms of helping you to understand what the curriculum is, how best to teach it, and how we can use the network that is a part of this research as a way to both improve the research itself as well as our own teaching. And so getting us started, we just have a quick overview of the entire presentation. You can see we'll be talking a little bit about background information, what is the basis for this curriculum and why this research is occurring, how the instructional model works and how this aligns to standards, how best to teach the curriculum and some tips and tricks we learned from the pilot study we had last year, how the research and data collection will work, a little bit about the FACS network, and then we'll conclude the video. Now, this is intended for the people who are a part of the 2019-2020 research study. However, if you are just using materials and want to better understand how to best use them, you can totally use this video. Just be aware that parts of this will not apply to primarily the research and data collection parts. So, and as we're doing this, I know as teachers, you're all busy folks. I was a teacher myself for 10 years. So feel free to have this playing in the background as you're doing other things, setting up your classroom or whatever it may be. I know this is a busy time of year, or if you're in the middle of the school year, this is even busier for you. So do whatever you have to do to make this work for your schedule. I would recommend having a pen and paper or a device ready to go so you can record some questions or ideas as you're hearing these things. A lot of information is going to be thrown your way, so it's good to have some way of maybe keeping track of some things that might be noteworthy or to keep track of questions as they come up. And again, you're going to hear this throughout the presentation, but this is a collaborative research project. This is not me telling you how to teach. This is me thinking, well, this might work, but I need to get your input. So don't feel like this is some sort of directive or anything like that. This is, again, a collaborative project, and we all have equal say in terms of how we're going to implement this work. All right, so some quick background information as far as what the heck this is and why we're doing it. So overall, this is an NSF-funded research project at Michigan State University, NSF being National Science Foundation. And what it does is focus really on two big areas. One is industry, and the question there is really, how can we change agriculture so that it can go on basically forever? So if we had to use the same methods for the same 1,000 years, what would those methods be that would enable us to produce a sufficient amount of food for the next millennia? And then on the education side, how can we use classroom instruction and out-of-class instruction in order to get future agriculturalists to adopt those methods? So basically, what methods do we need to adopt, and how can we use education to increase the adoption of those methods? We really have four specific components to this research. One is on agricultural production, and what are those sustainable methods? And by sustainability, we don't mean organic, we don't mean anything like natural, and we don't mean any kind of specific methods. What we mean are methods that we could use infinitely forever and still have agriculture. That it wouldn't cause any serious problems that would impair our capacity to produce food or impair the ecosystems on which food production depends. And this isn't so much direct research as it is synthesizing existing research. So for example, we're working with our research stations and working with existing literature to really synthesize and identify what are the key takeaways from the body of work that is. The second part is educational philosophy, and that really is, well, why does agricultural education exist? What should we be doing, and what should be our main purpose? The third part is the curriculum research, which is probably why you're here, and that's where we're creating research that reflects what agriculture needs to do and what our philosophies about ag education should be, and trying to assess the effectiveness of that curriculum. So really what we're trying to figure out is, well, based on what we know about what we need to be doing and how we should be doing it, how do we design curriculum that reflects that, and can we make it so that it's as effective as possible? And then finally, the last part is, well, how do we prepare teachers to do this? How do we enable them to have resources or access to resources that help make them more successful? So this video is a primary example of that fourth part. This is design-based research. The project that this is a part of, or that is a part of this work, is called DBR, or design-based research. And the idea of design-based research is we're trying to get away from this idea that a researcher is telling a teacher how to do their job, because a researcher really can't do that very effectively because they're not the one in that classroom. The teacher is, and they know their classroom the best. And so taking what the researcher knows about educational research and taking what the teacher knows about their classroom and its operations, we try to combine those expertise areas into one research project where it's not this person telling this person what to do, but those people working together to figure out what is the best way to do this kind of work. And so two key things about design-based research. One is collaborative. So you as a participant teacher, you have a say and your expertise matters. And so we need to hear your thoughts, your ideas, your proposals, your questions, your concerns as we're going through this work. Because again, that's expertise that we don't have as researchers. And secondly, this is iterative. It's going to change. We're going to learn things, we're going to respond to those changes, and we're going to implement those changes into our research. And so we never want to go in with this rigid, this is the way it is. We have some ideas about how education works, but part of the idea of design-based research is it tells us more about theories that we have going into the research so that we can revise and redesign those theories as we go into this work. Why are we doing this? Well, there's quite a few reasons, but here's a couple. First of all, we know that traditional forms of education, the content-based, memorization-based, traditional kinds of classroom-based education, really doesn't do a whole lot to change things outside the classroom. It might change a lot inside the classroom, but when we look at decision-making by students outside the classes or after graduation or both, we don't see a whole lot of impact from that kind of traditional form of education. And that's a big concern because agriculturalists have a huge impact on our country's sustainability overall. In fact, if you look at this picture, anything in gold is agriculture, anything in green is forestry. So that 72% actually involves this gold area right here and this one little green area right here. If we include these other green areas for forestry, it's an even larger number. So future agriculturalists will have an enormous impact on future sustainability for the United States as a whole. Secondly, we know that existing agricultural methods are not sufficiently sustainable. They can't go on forever. In fact, at our current pace, we're looking at some major disruptions to future agricultural production that actually to some extent are already occurring. And this being 2019 was a perfect example of a difficult time for agricultural production, especially in terms of very wet springs, very dry summers. But there's lots of other concerns as well, such as high rates of erosion, high rates of water contamination, and just a lack of preparation for a changing climate. And so we know that US agricultural methods need to change, and we know that education is key for that, but doesn't have a great track record so far of enabling that change in decision-making by agriculturalists. And so that's why this research project exists, is we're trying to find better ways to produce food that are more sustainable, and we're trying to find better forms of education that make it more likely that future agriculturalists will adopt those methods. So our key question in this research is how can we make student decision-making more evidence-based? Another term for this is science literacy. So in other words, how can we get students to make decisions based more on evidence and information that's valid rather than a Facebook post or what their parents think or what their friends think? And so this research is really based on a key premise. One, that improved science literacy, in addition to two, situated learning opportunities that are inherent in agricultural education, will result in more informed decision-making. And again, we're combining science literacy in science education based on breaking research with SAEs and other forms of situated learning in agricultural education to result in future agriculturalists who will make more informed decisions and hopefully, as a result, adopt more sustainable methods for food production. So a bit of an overview about what these things are. First, with our science content. We're really pushing this idea of three-dimensional science, which is inherent in the next generation science standards. These are arguably the most research-based academic standards we've had in the history of American education. This has been a decade-long project to figure out how students best learn science, what science should reflect in terms of the well-being of our country, and how to best implement that in terms of classroom instruction. And so in a nutshell, next generation science standards aligned instruction reflects three-dimensional science. And as you would guess, there are three parts to three-dimensional science, or three dimensions, those being disciplinary core ideas, cross-cutting concepts, and scientific and engineering practices. So a little details on what that entails, or a few details. Our disciplinary core ideas, that's here in the orange box, that really reflects what scientists know, and that's what we traditionally think of as content. But what NGSS and three-dimensional science learning do differently is we're minimizing the amount of content and maximizing the depth of comprehension of that content by students. So we want to get away from this mile-wide, inch-deep approach to science education, where we're trying to cover as much material and as much content as possible in too short of time. Instead, we're focusing only on the things that students absolutely need to know to better understand natural phenomena and the world around them. And so we don't have to have students recreate 300 or 400 or 500 years of scientific inquiry. We just have to have them know a few key fundamental ideas about the natural world to help them make sense of that. The second thing is scientific and engineering practices, and that's here in blue. And this is what scientists do. This is how a scientist determines what is real and what is not, or what is valid and what is not. And so it's this idea of we ask questions, we develop models, we carry out investigations, we use argumentation based on evidence, we communicate our findings, and we find consensus as we deliberate between each other. It's really what scientists do to figure out what they know and how they know what they know isn't wrong. The third part then is in a green box here, and that's our cross-cutting concepts. And that's what scientists think. And this is maybe the most difficult one to understand, because I think the blue and the orange parts really come naturally to us. But the green parts seems maybe a little more esoteric. But it's really how scientists think. So if you think about it, if I put a graph in front of you, this is the way you would make sense of that graph and what that graph is trying to communicate. You would look for a pattern, you'd look for cause and effect, you'd look for scale and proportion and quantity. You'd be connecting this to other systems and models that you're aware of. And so how scientists think is governed by these ideas. And when a scientist is effective in thinking scientifically, is because they're able to effectively apply these cross-cutting concepts. And this is very well aligned to our National Ag, Food, and Natural Resources academic standards. And that was by intent. And I know that because I was there when they were written. I was one of the 6 people that wrote our latest version of these. And so I realized that at the state level, we don't really look at these much. Usually we emphasize our state standards much more than the national. But I think it's important that you understand how the national standards work because A, I personally think they were well written, even though I'm obviously biased. But also B, a lot of our curriculum on the national level is reflective of this, as is other aspects and components of ag instruction, including FFA and SAEs for all. And so it's rather important to know how this works and what they entail. And so there's 3 levels to the National Ag, Food, and Natural Resources Standards. There's the Common Core Standards for Career and Technical Education. If you didn't know we had Common Core for CTE, we do. The second level is the actual standards, and that's here in the teal. And those are our performance indicators. And what those do is, well, they kind of tell us generally what our courses should be accomplishing for each of our career areas. And then finally, the lowest level is our sample measurements. These aren't standards, but these are, think of them like suggestions for what a teacher could do in order to achieve the standards in AF&R. And those sample measurements are divided into 3 categories. Our lowest level of comprehension is awareness. That's like your vocab and your basic content. We have an intermediate or interaction level, which is a second higher level. And it's really seeing if a student can utilize this information in order to figure out a problem or a question or accomplish something. And then finally, mastery. So we have a real world situation where a teacher is no longer helping a student. They're checking to see if a student actually has mastery over the content and can do things on their own unaided. So an example of what this looks like from our natural resources cluster, we have in green, our Common Core standard throughout all of career and tech ed. So this would be business and foods and ag ed and tech ed and so on. In teal, we have our actual standard, apply methods of classification to examine natural resources availability. And then here in the light green and tan, we have sample measurements. And again, these aren't standards. They look like what standards normally look like, but those are not standards. They're just hypothetical suggestions of what a teacher could do in order to achieve the standard in teal. And so you can see these are broken into levels. The left here is the awareness level. This is the interaction or intermediate level. And then on the right here, we have the mastery level. And you can see that as we move from left to right, the onus of responsibility becomes more on the student and the rigor becomes greater as we go from awareness to interaction to mastery. And again, really quickly, just to kind of drive home that point, awareness, interaction, mastery, and this is the actual standard. These are just suggestions. And then finally, we have our 3-circle model. And hopefully this is pretty familiar to you. If you're in agricultural education, this should be familiar to you. But if you need a refresher, or if you're outside of agricultural education, essentially this argues that agricultural education is composed of 3 interacting components. One being our classroom and laboratory-based instruction, And so this is where that next generation science standards, three-dimensional science learning component should come in. We have our FFA component, and that's where students are getting social-based learning opportunities in an organization like FFA that is intracurricular, that is related to the courses we teach, but technically outside of a regular school day or outside the classroom for the most part. And then finally, we have our SAE circle, our supervised agricultural experience. And what this is a situated form of learning in which a student should be getting career-based experiences in authentic settings with people with expertise in a field outside of a regular class operation or outside of a regular class period. And so this might take place at a school, but as much as possible, this should be in an authentic environment with people with expertise in that given field and an identity with a given or chosen career area. And so situated learning and SAEs are very similar, but they're not identical. Not all SAEs are situated learning, and not all situated learning is an SAE. And so situated learning means that we're taking a student, putting them in an authentic environment with people with expertise and identity in a given career area. And so Lev and Wenger were really the big ones to establish this as a theoretical perspective in education. They have a wonderful set of books on this that get into a lot of detail we won't get into here. But basically their argument is that true meaningful learning rarely occurs in a classroom. What actually is true meaningful learning is when we're engaged with people who have expertise in the field in an authentic environment, what they call legitimate peripheral participation in a community of practice. Now, as a former teacher, that's really hard for me to say because in my head, classrooms should be a hotbed of learning. But if you think about it, how you became a teacher. Most of your learning in order to become a teacher probably didn't occur in a school of education. That maybe provided you a basis and prepared you for future learning. But most of your learning actually probably occurred on the job as a student teacher, as a new teacher, and so on and so forth. And so we really are recognizing more and more in educational research that in order for meaningful learning to occur, it has to occur in an authentic context. And SAEs should, for the most part, occur in an authentic context whenever possible. So a couple clarifications. Again, 3D science instruction, this looks very different from what we're used to. It's probably not at all like what we had as students when we were going through school. And that makes it really tough as a teacher. Speaking as someone who was a science teacher, this is just a very different way to teach, and it feels very different. And so if it feels weird to teach this way, and if you're not quite sure if this is right, that's actually probably a good sign. Second clarification, again, not all SAEs are reflective of true situated learning. So for example, when I was a high school student, I had a dairy placement proficiency application, and that was my SAE, except that I never became a dairy farmer. I worked on our home farm, but I wasn't going to be a farmer. I was a teacher and a scientist. And so for me to have a real SAE that was reflective of situated learning, I should have been doing something in that career area. And so SAE for All, if you're familiar with that campaign that's occurring right now as we speak, this is reflective of that. And the argument from SAE for All is we have to begin with the end in mind, that we have to figure out what a student is going to be doing for a career and then encourage situated learning experiences in authentic scenarios with people with expertise in that field as often as possible. And so while some other things are okay, and it's good for students to do things like proficiency applications and FFA award programs, an SAE, if it's going to be as valuable as possible, should be specific to a career that they're most likely going to go into in a context that authentically involves that career situation with people with an identity and experience in that field. All right, and so that gave us kind of two competing visions for Ag Ed. Type 1 traditional program is one where classrooms really emphasize these rote skill development, where kids are doing suturing, or they're doing grafting, or they're doing these very rote skills, and they're not necessarily connecting that to more systems level understanding of phenomena in agriculture. The SAEs are open-ended and often not specific to their career. So like I described with my FFA proficiency when I was in high school. And students receive very specific instruction and acquire very specific skills, but they have very limited adaptability and ingenuity in agricultural careers after high school because they were never really taught to think that way or to approach careers in that manner. Whereas a type 2 agricultural program is much more progressive, and it much more emphasizes those scientific practices of analytic decision-making, critical thinking, argumentation based on evidence, and so forth, that in the classroom are really pushing students to explain how they know they're not wrong, and what evidence they use to reach a conclusion, and how they know their stance on an issue is both valid and worth considering. Their SAE should be very prescriptive, not that they can't change, but a student should have a very specific career goal in mind, and their experiences as often as possible should be specific to that career goal and involve people and experiences in that career field. And so when students graduate from our programs, they don't have as many specific rote skills as they might in a more traditional program, but they have a much greater capacity to evolve and adapt in a rapidly changing industry, which we almost certainly will have as our students move forward. All right, we're pretty well into this program. This would be a great time if you need to pause for whatever reason, go ahead and pause. If you need to, use a restroom, grab a drink of water, take a break from this, that's fine. But let's take a second if you need to and pause, and then we'll keep going. All right, and we're back. So we're going to get a little bit into the FACS instructional model here. And this is really just to help you understand why it is designed the way it is. Because, again, this is going to look very different, and you might have some doubts. And so as you move forward, it might be very helpful for you to understand why it is that we actually made the choices we made when it came to the curriculum and instruction. So again, our FACS instructional model, this is a little more elaborate version of that, but again, we're combining improved science literacy with situated learning opportunities in agriculture education to enable more informed decision-making. And so in a sense, we see that the FACS curriculum is an intersection between agri-science instruction that is aligned to NGSS and uses three-dimensional science learning with our situated career learning, our out-of-class experiences with people in the field we intend to go into in authentic environments. And all of our decisions really reflect this model ultimately. Obviously, there's lots of details and things like that, but this is the big overarching goal. So the way we typically design the curriculum is to follow what we call the FACS 5-day week, which might sound a bit ridiculous because most schools use a 5-day week, but there's a reason to this, as you'll see. And so typically we follow this 5-day pattern where day 1 is model development. When students come in, we'll give them data, or we might give them a case study, they might complete a small experiment, but we're giving them a phenomena to try to figure out in groups. So it might be how biodiversity and ecosystem function relate to each other. It might be different case studies about pollution and how they reflect what pollution actually is and how it works, or whatever the case may be. We're giving them a real-world situation to try to figure out in groups and develop an explanatory model. On day 2, they'll come in and we'll give them the core ideas about that phenomenon. Again, there's really no reason for students to reinvent 300 or 400 years of scientific inquiry. We can give them some answers, and that will help them to develop a better comprehension of that phenomenon. So once students have developed the model, we're going to challenge them with core ideas and then say, does your model still hold up? Does it make sense? Or do you need to revise? And if students need to revise, that's actually probably a very good thing, because that's what we as scientists do all the time. We're constantly revising our ideas and our models in order to fit new data and new information as it comes in. On day 3, we're getting into our inquiry and investigation. So now, based on that phenomenon, students are taking their explanatory model and taking a specific case and seeing if they can accurately make predictions about what will occur using their model. So whatever the situation or the phenomenon might be for that week, once they've developed a model and tested it against things we already know, then they're going to test it by making predictions in a specific case using specific parameters. On day 4, we start to get into assessment. And I'm sure as teachers, we all have mixed feelings about assessments, and that's fine. What we're really trying to do here on day 4 is cement ideas in kids' heads, that we want them to be more aware of what they know and maybe more aware of where their knowledge isn't quite as strong as it should be. And so day 4, having this review and assessment is really meant to cement these ideas in their head and help them to build a greater awareness or greater metacognition of what they know or don't know. And then finally, on day 5, we have our career and community connections. And again, this is the idea that we want to bring the outside world into the classroom and vice versa. So, for example, in climate change, we might ask a student, is anyone you're shadowing, are they arguing ideas that are the opposite of what we've decided is reality in our classroom? Or if we're talking about habitat loss, we might talk about, well, how does this relate to your future career area? And how might this affect decisions you are going to be making once you actually get into that career? And so again, the idea is we want our science literacy to extend beyond the classroom itself and into the decisions that students will be making after high school. And so as a result, if we want that to occur, we need to really emphasize these connections between their situated learning SAE experiences outside the classroom and the content and ideas we're covering during the class time. Now, this is our typical 5-day week. This isn't every single week. This is most weeks, but it's not every single week. And the idea is, especially at the end of a unit, we want students to be doing these big projects that are summative in nature. And so not every week will involve this, but most do. And we find that students really like this structure. Now, if your 5-day week takes 4 days or 6 days, that's fine. Sometimes your day 5 might actually be the following Monday, and that's okay. What we find, though, is that students really start to understand what day 1 or day 2 or day 3 means, and they really appreciate that structure in their curriculum. And as long as we break it up every now and then, they tend to really appreciate the idea of knowing what to expect week in and week out. We talked a lot about models, but haven't really explained what that means. And so what we mean by an explanatory model is really just a way of concisely encapsulating how a phenomenon works or what it means. So sometimes a model can be physical. So for example, you might have a physical model of a solar system, and that has value. It tells us how the solar system operates to some extent in terms of where planets are and how their orbits work. But usually when we talk about an explanatory model, we're talking about a cognitive model. So for example, in terms of ecosystem function, a cognitive explanatory model would be, well, the greater the biodiversity of an ecosystem, the greater its resilience, and the more ecosystem services it can provide. Vice versa, the lower the biodiversity, the more fragile the ecosystem, and the fewer services that ecosystem can provide. That would be an explanatory model. That's a model that we can test, it's one we can revise, and it's one that we can use to make predictions. And so that is our big goal with this 5-day structure, is having students get in the habit of mind of developing explanatory models, testing them with evidence, making sure they have predictive power, and refining them through argumentation and deliberation in groups. And if we can enable that to occur, we should be able to develop much more scientifically literate students who are much more adept at using information to figure out how the world works. And so we can kind of see that in our 5-day structure here, where in the red we have day 1, our model development with the case studies or data or experiments, or whatever it may be. Day 2 is our core ideas. We're using what we know in an information-rich society. How well does our explanatory model hold up based on those ideas? Day 3 is our model refinement and testing. Again, does our model provide predictive power, or what do we need to change about it in order for it to do so? Day 4 is review and assessment. Again, we're trying to make those ideas concrete in a student's head and helping them to become aware of where their strengths are and weaknesses in terms of their comprehension. And then day 5 are career and community connections. How does the model you developed relate to the decisions that you will be making in a personal or career situation during high school and after high school? So as an example, we talked about our week 4 ecosystems unit. On day 1, they come in and they have a tabletop ecosystem, which you can see a picture of here on the right. These are consisting of saltwater, algae, brine shrimp, and bacteria. And so we use this as a model of an ecosystem, and it is in fact an ecosystem, but it's a very simple one. It's one where we only have one producer and one consumer and one category of decomposers being the bacteria. And so students are using this simplified model to try to figure out, well, how does this work? What makes it fragile or resilient? What is biodiversity, and how can we tell if we have it here? How does a biodiverse ecosystem compare in terms of resilience and services versus one with less biodiversity? On Tuesday, we try to clarify some of these questions and ideas that emerge in day 1, and we're going to use that with our disciplinary core ideas. On Wednesday, we refine our models through argumentation. We see if they have predictive power, and we try to basically come to a consensus across the class in terms of, is there one explanatory model that works across all of these situations? Thursday is our review and assessment. Again, we're trying to make those ideas concrete. And then Friday, we're connecting that to real world situations. So if you are a farmer, if you are a DNR warden, if you're an agri-scientist, how do these ideas affect the job that you might do someday and the decisions that you will be making as a part of that job? Again, we're really talking about guided comprehension here. We want to avoid this traditional way of doing science that involves memorization and extensive amounts of content and vocabulary. And instead, we want to focus more on encouraging systems level thinking, of helping students to appreciate what are the connections between these concepts and how do those connections help us to better understand the complex nuances that are a part of these phenomena. So again, this is more about figuring out than learning about. We're not learning about ecosystems. We're trying to figure out how biodiversity relates to ecosystem function. We're not learning about climate change. we're trying to figure out what is the relationship between a CO2 molecule and heat retainment in our atmosphere, and so on and so forth. All right, again, if you need to take a quick break, this would be a great time to do it. Otherwise, we'll get started here in just a sec. All right, and we're back. So you got the broad overview. This is more of the nuts and bolts for how we actually teach this curriculum. So the key resource in teaching this curriculum is the FACS website. And so we're just going to take a brief tour of this. So if you go to facsnsf.org, it will take you to this page. And you can see across the top here, we have our menu. So obviously our home button. We have our curriculum. The natural resources one is posted. The horticulture one will be posted soon. This is August of 2019, so soon after that. The goal is to have it up by December. And animal science is to be determined. It depends on how well these first two courses go and how much time we have available. We have a few other resources here in terms of how to teach FACS, and eventually you'll find this video there. Our consent forms, obviously we'll talk about that more in a bit here, but obviously those are very vital for research. And how to use the FACS bioreactors, which again, we'll talk about more in just a second. And our training and professional development, and then a few other resources available for you as they might be needed. So the biggest resource on here that you will probably need in the immediate future is the natural resources curriculum. And so if we click on that and scroll down, you can see week by week, we've established that 5-day week schedule and when things will occur. Now, just to caution, this is not a script. You can teach this however you want. Now, obviously, if you're a part of the research, there's some limitations, but for the most part, you're the one in charge. You're the one flying this experimental plane. And so it will be up to you to make the decisions that are best for your classroom environment as you know it. But this is something of a guide to help you understand how someone could implement this curriculum and how it might look on a day-to-day, week-by-week basis. And so as we go back to our PowerPoint here, a few things to be aware of as you're going through that website. Each week, again, we're dividing these up on a week-by-week basis. Each week we'll have a few key resources, and probably the most important one is that weekly packet. And that is what you see here on Monday for week 7 in this particular example. You can see you have two options, a Word option and a PDF. Pretty much everything on this website for curriculum is available in an editable form, either a Word document or a PowerPoint. It's also usually available in a PDF format if that was an option. And there's a reason for this. They're available in Word or PowerPoint because if you need to make changes, you have that option of doing it. The PDFs are available because they're easier to open on a browser, they're easier for students to access, and they usually just require less time and memory to download. And so whatever works best for you is what you should use. But that weekly packet, that's going to have basically everything you need for the week with the exception of the PowerPoint and the answer keys. So other than the PowerPoint and answer keys, everything you need for any week should be in that weekly packet. And that's going to include the appendix, which will have all of the materials you need for the labs. For the assessments are here. So students could see them in advance. Now, they shouldn't. Most students usually wouldn't go to this website, but be aware those assessments are out there. And that's partly okay because ideally you're using as much as possible the short answer questions. The multiple choice questions I would recommend is using as a review if necessary. You might want to scatter a few of them in randomly so that students, are paying attention to the specifics. But really the better assessments are the group quizzes, the short answer questions. And so do whatever you need to do. I realize that grading a whole bunch of short answer questions every single week is not feasible for most people. But it's, I think, more important to understand or to expect that students understand the bigger questions, the bigger ideas, and the questions that reflect them than the small nuances of what different words mean or whatever that may be. So again, be aware those are out there. The answer keys are not posted on the website. And so if you are a participating teacher, I can send the answer keys to you by email. And especially for those who have signed up for the full research participation, you will be getting an email from me with those answer keys. If you're not one of those teachers, shoot me an email and I will make sure that I can get those to you. Just make sure that you use an appropriate school address because I do check to make sure you are actually a teacher and not a student pretending to be a teacher. But again, for the most part, everything you need, with the exception of the answer keys, are in each week's units on that curriculum website. There are PowerPoints, and a lot of people sometimes groan when we mention that. We don't want the PowerPoints to be used in a lecture style, though. And we find this not only not effective, but it's not why we wrote them. The PowerPoints are there to provide group work time structure, essentially. And so what we're trying to do is provide these PowerPoints as a resource for students to work with each other. And so if we go back to our website, we can see that, and I do need to update the first couple of weeks, but you'll see that there's two kinds of PowerPoints. There's just the standard notes, and then there's notes with questions. And ideally, those are the ones that you should be using. And so here's a screenshot of what that looks like. And so we've taken the core concepts, and then we follow those up with questions that we want students to respond to in small groups. So maybe they're writing this on a whiteboard, maybe they're using Google Docs, but students should be working in small groups to deliberate and argue over what would be the best response to these questions based on the previous information. So it provides structure to students so that they know what they need to be focusing on, but we really want to emphasize that small group work and that collaboration within those groups in order to answer these questions. Now, you can, as a class, come back and say, what did we have? You might have someone, you might cold call in a group to say what they had and see if other people agree. That's totally fine. But what we want to avoid is having a teacher stand in front of a class for 45 minutes and read off of the slides or lecture to the class, because that's neither engaging nor effective in most cases. Now, if you find that works for you, we can talk about that. But for the most part, what we want to do is have students work in small groups using this as a guide, with a teacher facilitating their consideration of the content rather than leading direct lecture with the sage on the stage approach to instruction. The more we can have small group deliberation, the more effective this should be in most cases. The other key resource that's available on that website is the Supervised Career Experience Packet. And so very briefly, we're going to give you a quick run through of what this looks like. This is the packet designed to scaffold and structure SAEs and situated learning as part of the class experience. And so you can see there's two parts to this. There's an in-class packet, and that involves our career experience, our requirements, and really what are the details of this project. It then involves content or classroom instruction for choosing a career, choosing a college, resumes, cover letters, and job interviews. And the idea for this is that periodically throughout the semester, we're taking a Friday and we're taking some time to provide students with some guidance about what career they might choose, what college would support that. And it's not necessarily college, it could be military apprenticeship, but basically what do they need to do between high school and actually starting that career. And then, the mechanics of how to do a cover letter, a resume, and a job interview. The second part of this, as we scroll down, is the out-of-class component. And the idea of the Supervised Career Experience Project is that students are getting 15 hours of shadowing experience in a specific career area. Now, it could be shadowing, it could be entrepreneurship, it could be a part-time job, it could be research, it could be service. There's a number of options, just like we see in the SAE for all format. But again, the goal is for students to get at least 15 hours in an authentic setting in experiences related to the career area they want to go into. Now, brass tacks, that's a very tough thing to do, especially in your first 2 years. And so if you're doing this and you're finding it very difficult to find appropriate experiences for students, it's okay for them to combine experiences. So as we scroll down, this is a planning document. This is your hours verification. These are the reviews. I apologize. Actually, let's scroll up here. Students have options for how they can do this. So you can see part-time job, entrepreneurship with their own business, agri-science, become an educator, job shadowing, volunteering. Their 15 hours can be made up of a combination of these things. So it doesn't have to be 15 hours in one of these all by itself. Furthermore, so let's say a student wants to become a veterinarian, but they can only shadow or do a ride along with a veterinarian for 5 hours. All right, well, combine their job at McDonald's with 5 hours of shadowing and 5 hours of volunteer work, and then you have your 15 hours. And so do whatever you have to do to make it work, but as much as possible, students should be getting at least one experience with someone in their career field. Sometimes this means we have to think outside the box. And so if a student wants to be a rocket scientist, and I had this when I was a teacher, you might not know a rocket scientist. No, I did. So it worked out. We had them Skype with a friend of mine who works for SpaceX in California. But all right, so you don't know a rocket scientist, but you do know engineers in your area. Well, rocket scientists are basically rocket engineers. And so having someone work with an engineer and understand what the engineering field is like is actually really valuable experience to become a rocket scientist. And so don't think that you're just isolated to that one specific career area. Broaden the career area if necessary to make it work. Now, you can see here the 7th option is a 10-page paper. In my experience, I've always said that's only in an emergency. So if a kid was in a coma for 2 months, then maybe we'll let them do the paper. But I've never had a single student do that. In our pilot study, no student chose to do it. So it's really only there if absolutely necessary. Pretty much considered a non-option for 99% of our students. All right, so that's our career experience packet. Last thing, we have a few more resources. We have what are called FACS bioreactors, and this was developed as part of U.S. Department of Energy research. This was originally meant for biofuel research, but we found it actually has a ton of applications for just about anything in biology and agriculture. This is not a necessity, but I would encourage you to consider building these for your class if you're doing the FACS curriculum. Because honestly, as a teacher, they were phenomenal. I absolutely love them. If you teach any kind of research or inquiry in an agri-science class, if you teach a biofuels class, these are phenomenal and I just have a million uses. We're not going to get into too much detail for the sake of time, but basically what they do is they're just a controlled reaction chamber. We can control the temperature, we can control aeration, we can control just about any biological variable we want to. You can build them for about $35 or $40 a piece. They're essentially a laboratory in its own container. And so if you can have 1 or 2 of these per student group, you can get some amazing inquiry. We do use these for the Tabletop Ecosystem and Tabletop Climate Change Lab that's in this curriculum, but they're not essential. You could get by using a sealed mason jar and be almost as good. It would take some finagling and engineering to make those work, and that's something we can work on. If you have questions, just contact me. But don't feel like you have to get these, but if you can, I would highly recommend them. They're very simple and easy to build. Essentially, all you need to do is drill holes with a cordless drill for each of these items and then insert them into the device and you're good to go. All the materials, all the ingredients, all the necessary components are available on the FACS website in the user manual. I even have the NASCO and Amazon website links on there. And so if you want to build them, please do, but don't feel like you have to. If you're someone who needs to have a standards alignment document, there is that for the natural resources course. The horticulture one will be coming after the curriculum is completed, and that is available on the website. There are other resources. One I would really highly recommend checking out is the 9 talk moves for classroom science. That's really a way to drive classroom argumentation and discourse forward in a very productive way. And again, I am a resource for you as well. If you ever have any questions or problems, please shoot me an email. It might take me a day to get to you. I have a very busy schedule and a lot on my plate this year, but I will do my best to get back to you every single time within 24 hours. It might be I need more time to get back to you, but I will try to respond within 24 hours on a weekday. All right, again, if you need to take a break, go ahead. I'm going to take a drink of my iced tea. Sorry about that, and we'll get started in just a sec. All right, and we're back. So a couple things. Again, points of clarifications. You're one flying the experimental plane. I might have designed this experimental plane, but you are the pilot of it. And so if you need to change something to make it work for your students, for your classroom, for your school, please do. That's why things are in Word and PowerPoint documents. They're meant to be changeable and editable and so on and so forth. The only thing I ask is that if you are a part of the research, a part of the data collection, let me know when you make big changes. Now, if you did a minor change or caught a spelling error, that you don't need to tell me that. But if you're making a major change, if you're changing the order in which you're presenting things, or if you're changing content or things like that, or if you're substituting a lab or a video, let me know those things. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is because it might affect our data analysis. So if your class has very different data than the other classes because of a change you made, we need to know it's because of that change. The other thing is maybe your changes are better than what I have. This is not the final draft. And so I know from having done this research for a number of years now that oftentimes what teachers tell us for changes they made are sometimes way better than whatever we came up with. And so again, if you make any changes, that's fine. Just let me know so that I can factor that in when we're analyzing the data and so that I can look at that and see if that's actually better than what I had originally. This is design-based research, so it's not me telling you how to teach, it's us trying to figure out how to best teach together. And so let me know your input, let me know your ideas, let me know your complaints as nicely as possible, because again, we're in this together. I don't have all the answers, as I said. You are the one flying this airplane, I just designed it. And so you have to let me know how it goes, and we'll figure out the answers together. And again, everything here is a working draft. you will find problems here and there. You're going to find spelling errors. You might find links are broken. That's going to happen. This is not a professional curriculum company. This is not a whole team of people getting paid a good salary to do this. This is really just me with a guidance committee overlooking my shoulder to figure out if I'm doing something that's actually good. And so you will find problems. That's a part of this game. So as we work out the bugs and find things to correct, let us know, and we'll make those changes as we go. We did a pilot study of this last year. And so for the 2018-2019 school year, we did a pilot study with 2 courses in 1 school. And boy, did we learn a lot from that. And the 2 big takeaways we had from that pilot study was, number 1, SAEs matter so much. We did a pre and post assessment of student decision making. And across the class as a whole, the only thing that changed was for the things associated with what students did as an SAE as a class. So this class adopted the school's recycling program. They took it over. Now, whether or not that's an SAE is debatable. I accept that. But basically, this was an authentic experience that students had as a class together. And when we looked at our quantitative data in terms of changes in behaviors and decisions, this was the only one that was statistically significant across all students. So we looked at, I think, 32 areas or something like that. None of them were statistically significant except for this one, and was 4 times the critical value. So it was like very statistically significant. And so the SAEs really matter. And on an individual basis, we saw that as well, that when students change decisions and behaviors, it was very rarely because of the classroom content alone, if it ever was. The only time we really strongly saw changes in behaviors and attitudes and decision-making was when classroom content was paired with out-of-class experiences. So SAEs matter a lot if we want to change student behaviors and student decision-making inside and outside the classroom. The SCE packet, the Supervised Career Experience packet, does help a lot. Most people are very fond of that. That was actually part of the SAE for All campaign, and we developed that way back in 2014. So that's been tested by a lot of schools. It may not work for you, but we found it works for most teachers. And again, it's in a Word form, so if you need to modify or change something, that's fine. If you find that 15 hours is impossible, start with 10 and work your way up. Whatever the case may be, make it work for you. It's really important that you integrate those experiences outside the classroom into the classroom content. And you will find very specific prompts for that in the content, and try to utilize those as often as you can. So when there's time for students to share their experiences in job shadowing, try to work that into the content you're working as often as you can. Because the more we form bridges between what happens in the classroom and what happens outside the classroom, the more the in-classroom stuff shapes the decisions made outside the classroom. And so that is absolutely vital. And then again, like we mentioned with recycling, the whole class SAE projects are really valuable because they shape classroom culture and they start to give students a very strong identity. And so if you have the option of doing something like adopting school recycling, taking over a school habitat, something that you can do as a whole class that will shape the identity of students in that class, I would highly strongly encourage that. All right, second big takeaway. This is hard. This is a really hard thing to teach. And so I applaud you for being a part of this, because this is not easy by any stretch of the means. I hope that it will make you very effective as a teacher. And I think it's very rewarding to do. And we found that students and teachers found this to be a very rewarding thing to do in our pilot study. But it's just hard, especially the first couple weeks. Students, if they haven't had anything like this before, will complain a lot, especially your straight A students. Because your straight A students kind of assume there was a bargain where they memorize a few things and take a multiple choice test and then they get an A. And then they find they really have to work in this class and they will really push back. So be prepared for that, because until about week 4 or 5, students aren't seeing the light, and all they know is they're working really hard to get the same grades or worse. And so you will get some pushback, but let them know it's going to be hard up front. Encourage them in those first few weeks, and know that it really takes at least a solid month before students really start to pick up on how this works. SAEs for All is also very difficult. The SCE packet is very difficult if you haven't done this before. And so if you don't have a community network that makes this easy, if you don't have those strong connections with a wide variety of professionals and businesses in your community, this is a very difficult thing to do. And I speak from experience in having piloted the SAE for All campaign about 5 years ago. it takes at least a good 2 years. But once you get that network established, it gets much easier and it starts to take on a life of its own. So the long and short of this is hang in there. It will be frustrating at times. I am here as a resource. We'll have a network as a resource. Just stick with it and it will get better. All right, again, good place to pause if you need to, and we'll be back here in just a sec. All right, so if you are involved with the research and data collection, this involves you. If you are not involved in research and data collection, if you're not a participating school, you're pretty much done. So you might as well close out the window here. But for those of you sticking on, again, in the research portion of this, because this is a research campaign, we have two big questions. One being, well, how do students and teachers perceive and respond to this kind of instruction? How, if you haven't taught NGSS aligned science content, if you haven't done SCEs for all, if you haven't combined those two kinds of instruction, how do you feel about this? Do you feel it's effective? Do you feel like it's working? Do you like it? Do you hate it? That's really a big question. Well, will teachers do this and stick with it? And will students appreciate this kind of work and find value in it? The second research question is, well, does it work? How much does it affect decisions made outside the classroom? If we use this throughout the nation for every future agriculturalist, would it change the industry to make it more viable and sustainable and create a better future for it? And so the data for this is really three big components for data. One being teacher interviews. So 2 to 3 times a semester, I'm sitting with each teacher, asking them their perceptions and how things are going. Student focus groups, which we'll talk about more in a second, but essentially we're taking 4 students per class and then twice a semester asking for their input. And then pre and post assessments, where we're looking at changes in science literacy and changes in behaviors and decision-making among the students in this research as a part of this curriculum. We also use classroom observations, and that's where I'm either going to a school or taking part virtually through Skype or Zoom, and then student classwork and my own field notes as our forms of data. For teachers, there's 3 kinds of participation. There's full participation. That's where we're doing student data collection for both semesters, natural resources in the fall and horticulture in the spring. Half participation is where we're collecting student data from either natural resources in the fall or horticulture in the spring. And for beginning teachers, those who are student teachers or only have a couple years of experience, we're not going to collect student data because you have enough on your plate already, believe me. But we will be interviewing you to get your perception on what this is like because, well, as a new teacher, you probably had some expectations coming into this. And so as a newer beginning teacher, how does this maybe conform to what you were expecting? How does this conflict with it? And what is your stance on it? Is this something that you would stick with or do you intend to move on to something else? Alrighty. Because this is a research that involves human subjects, we have to follow Federal Institutional Review Board guidelines. We're very serious about protecting the consent and well-being of all of our human subjects, those being you as teachers and our students and everyone else. That requires consent in writing from all of the people involved with this research, being you as a teacher, your administrator, your students, and their parents. These forms are on the website, and I would recommend getting this to students, your administrator, and parents before school starts if possible. These are absolutely vital. We really can't do anything until we have them from everyone. And so make sure you take care of this as soon as possible. Do not wait until school starts. Start it before school starts. Now, if you are a new teacher and you're not doing student data collection, you don't need student and parent data, but you should probably send a letter home explaining that this is going on. You do still need teacher consent form and administrator consent form. And again, those are on the website. If you're not sure what you need, feel free to email me and I'll be happy to help you out. Students and parents can turn down consent. They can deny to provide consent to you, and that's okay. They have that right, and they can still be a part of your class. The only thing is we just can't get any data from them. So we can't have any identifiable data in terms of student work, student tests. If we're filming a classroom observation, they can't be on film in the camera. So basically, we just have to take extra steps to make sure that they are protected and not a part of data collection. Now, when we do, for example, like class-wide data, like testing data, they might factor into the class average, and that's okay. As long as the data can't be traced back to them and it's not identifiable, that's okay. But anything like a classroom assignment or being on film, if they do not provide consent, then we have to make sure that they are not included in those data collection. Focus groups, as I mentioned, are really key. Every participating school for every semester should have a focus group with 4 students and 2 alternates. This group should reflect a wide variety in terms of ability and background. So if you have very diverse classes, our focus groups should be very diverse as well. We don't want the 4 smartest students you have in your class. We want a wide range of abilities to be somewhat representative as much as possible of your class as a whole. And so again, we will need to choose 4 students and 2 alternates. They do get compensated for this. You can let them know that, but this does require some time outside of class in most cases. So it might be lunch or after school or before school or something like that, but we do need to have volunteers. And again, they do need to be available for out-of-class data collection, mostly being interviews and a couple of other assessments. These focus groups will meet twice per semester. So we'll do a mid-semester interview and an end-of-semester interview. And again, usually those take place outside of class, but if need be, they can occur during class as well. Students are compensated for those interviews and potentially for other forms of data collection. You as teachers, as well as those students, are compensated, as I mentioned. Usually we use gift cards from Amazon or iTunes for that because they give us some traceability. And we typically provide those forms of compensation after we complete a benchmark. So for example, after you turn in student data and their consent forms, then you would get a gift card for that. You're not going to get rich from these. These are not, lavish or anything like that. It's really just an extra appreciation and an incentive to meet a deadline, because I know as teachers it's busy and you got a lot on your plate. So it's just a little extra incentive to get to meet the deadlines that we have. All right, we'll take a quick break here if you need to, and then we'll briefly conclude with our FACS network and wrap this up. All right, so again, key for this work is to have a network of participating teachers. We need to have this group of those who are involved with the research, in part for moral support, but also because it's just a functional thing, that the more we can depend on each other, the more that we can use each other for questions or tips or tricks or resources, the more effective this is going to be. And so whatever way possible, we need to establish a network for participating teachers, either by email or NAAE's Communities of Practice or Facebook or Schoology or some format, so that we can share ideas. And so I will be reaching out to you initially by email to figure out what is the best way for us to reach out to each other. But what I'm envisioning is basically to have something where if you have a question, rather than just email me, we can shoot out an email to the group as a whole, because odds are someone else encountered that issue as well, and they might have a way better idea for how to address it than I would. Again, I'm not the one flying this plane, I just designed it. So other people flying the airplane might have way better suggestions than I would, because they're the ones actually doing this in the classroom. If you need to contact me, please do. And again, if it's something that applies to everyone, it would be a good idea to CC those other teachers. And so, I'll be in touch with the details about how to do that. But again, the more we can address questions and challenges and problems as a group, the more our solutions will be effective and valuable for our needs. Again, my email is there, cohncray@msu.edu. Give me at least 24 hours to respond. I usually respond within 24 hours. If it's a weekend, it might be just a bit longer, but I try to get back to you as soon as possible. And usually I check my email every single day. Limitations. This is a big project. And so just to give you an idea, there's a limited amount of things that I can do with this work. So we are doing a very similar project for this in biology. That involves dozens of researchers and professionals. The budget is millions of dollars, in the tens of millions of dollars. On the flip side, this particular project, the FACS research project, I'm basically the only researcher on it, and we have a budget of a couple $1,000s. So this is a really big project in terms of size and scope for the limited constraints we have for personnel and money. So basically, we are a ragtag bunch here. We're the underdog go-getters, hence underdog. And just know that going into it that, we're going to encounter some issues, we're going to have some needs, and they might not always get addressed because of those limitations, but we're going to do our best. And again, the more that we can rely on each other as a network, the more likely it is that those won't be an issue. All right, that pretty much wraps it up. So just a quick recap. Again, we're a team. Let's work with each other as much as we can, and this will be as effective as possible. You have flexibility. This is not me telling you how to teach. This is not a script. These are just a series of resources. The only non-negotiables are science literacy and situated learning, because they're at the heart of the research. Obviously, we have to involve in those as we described them earlier. But again, you're welcome to move things around or change the order of things, to speed up the schedule or slow it down, whatever needs to occur for it to work in your classroom, that's what you need to do. Again, just let me know if you make changes so that I can factor that into our analysis and so that I can see if that's actually the better way to teach. Everything here is a working draft, and so there's nothing we can't change. Just again, let me know if we do need to change things, and don't be afraid to reach out. Thank you again for making it all the way to the end of this very long presentation. Good luck this year, and let me know if there is anything I can do to help. And that should conclude our presentation. Thanks again, and have a great year.